This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. In this episode, I'm joined by acclaimed garden designer Andrew Fisher Tomlin to discuss the craft of planting design, the skills and knowledge needed to thrive in the profession, and the evolving role of planting designers today. He also shares insights from his new book, The Modern Professional Planting Designer, which is a novel and interesting look at the processes behind successful planting design.
I was asked to write this book by quite a few people in indirect ways, because I had quite a lot of students saying to me, can you tell me how all these different books fit together? And even Nigel Dunnett said to me, oh yeah, because I just talk about what I do. And so there were lots of people talking about what they did, but there was nothing out there that said, well, how does this all connect together? What's the context for one person against another? And I guess with teaching planting design for such a long time and doing it, I felt that perhaps this is the time to write the book and write about how this all fits together. So that's kind of my main motivation. From a point of view of what the outcome was, I started with all that knowledge of teaching and about planting design. And of course, with London College of Garden Design, I had the most amazing people come in and talk. But I'm not always there to hear them. But I kind of sat down and did everything from scratch again, because teaching is a completely different thing than writing a book. You know, you're not in the room with people to answer their questions when you're writing a book. So it's quite a major kind of rewrite for me of what I know. And of course, in doing that, you suddenly realise I'm quite a logical person. The book was all set out on a spreadsheet from the start, but completely changed by the time I'd finished, because there are all these other things I wanted to bring into it, particularly around sustainability. And that's a theme through the book, and it's a chapter in itself.
Yeah, I noticed it's very sustainability heavy, I would say, in reading it. That's really struck me, which again is so topical and so important to embrace.
Yeah, I don't think it's just like a current trend or something. I think it's just what we have to do for the future. It's kind of here to stay. And people veer away from the S word and things, but we're all trying to do our bit, and sustainability covers so much, which is, things like biodiversity and talking about changing climate and resilience in our planting. And it's not just about planting from a list of trees that are going to be resilient for the future, which we hear a lot about. People like Kew Gardens and a huge amount of research on there. And there's really interesting stuff you can learn from them. It's kind of all free to access. It's about how do you create planting and planting design to be resilient. So how do you put plants together to do that? And in writing about that and realizing what I've been trying to do in my own planting, I ended up having some really good conversations with people around things like how fragile purely perennial planting is. So there's lots of people who kind of go, oh, I'm going to do naturalistic design. Well, naturalistic design doesn't necessarily be sustainable. Naturalistic design is an approach to planting which people feel very comfortable with because it's all about nature. But it's what we call naturalistic design is just what the Victorians were calling picturesque design in the 19th century. So it's kind of nothing new, and it's a look. It's like, well, if you're going to do naturalistic planting, how is that biodiverse? How is it resilient? And I think there are people now looking at those almost purely perennial mixes with grasses and saying, okay, I need to go back at that and look at different layers. I need to be looking at putting in a tree layer and a shrub layer and making it more diverse and more permanent as well. So we're talking about permanent vegetation, which is so important when we start thinking about sustainability.
But it's not fair to say that it's not a how-to, because it is, but not in the conventional sense. So it's not, this is how I do it, this is how you can do it. But it's more like holding a mirror up to somebody who does planting design and saying, have a look at your practices, which is why it's so different to a lot of books I've read and why I like it a lot.
Well, that's a relief. Uh, I think what it was is I talked to a lot of planting designers, and not just kind of the names that people know, but also people who are making a good living primarily out of plants and designing with plants. And everyone has their own approach. They have their own kind of what I call a framework for working with plants. And I recognize that probably everybody does the same things, but in different amounts and sometimes in different orders. But basically, this idea that the success of what they do often comes from a really thorough and sometimes complex discovery process where they're kind of discovering what's on the site. And if you listen to people talking about things like the importance of soil, the good sort of horticultural practice about preparing the soil well, but also what soil do you start with? That's part of the discovery process that we have. So it's not about, oh, I've got to do a planting design, so I'm going to sit down at a drawing board and start drawing something out in 2D. It's that whole discovery before it. And that's something which is good to remind ourselves we do, but nearly every designer will do that. But then also defining it. And you get a good planting design by having a strong narrative, whether that's a very practical narrative, something like a drought resilient garden, or whether it's something much more conceptual, something like a planting design which has been designed on the basis of or inspired by, say, seasonal tides or something like that. And so that, I find, is something that designers are not necessarily very good at doing, is creating that really, really strong narrative and thinking about the atmosphere they want to create. What am I going to feel when I walk into this planting? What am I going to experience? And I think the success of some of these big perennial plantings that we've seen over the last 10 years is because they're very immersive and they're very atmospheric, but they're no more atmospheric than walking into an ancient woodland or something like that. And so I think that's the bit that a lot of designers don't use before they start thinking, well, so what approach am I going to take to planting? Is it going to look ornamental? Is it going to be naturalistic? Am I going to go wild with it?
Yeah, and I have to say, I think narrative is important in a garden because it elevates it beyond just, this is a collection of plants that I like or that suit the site. I think it just ties everything together. Yeah, I couldn't agree more about the narrative, actually.
Yeah. If you think of the gardens that you love, and everyone loves different gardens, often I would challenge you that you will always find a really good story there, whether it's about the people who've always gardened there, or whether it's about particular plants or its setting, whatever, there's usually a really good story around those plants.
Yeah, absolutely. So thinking about gardens, and you've chosen some really good examples, you've got a lot of case studies in the book, and some of them, or a lot of them, I think, wouldn't necessarily be gardens that we've seen before, have profiled. How did you find these spaces?
The key to me was to do exactly what you said, is kind of find new modern planting designs that people have done and were done by people who are using plants as one of their main materials, which might sound a bit of a strange thing to say, but I'm thinking about the landscape architects in there. We tend to think landscape architects can be kind of all about street schemes and public spaces, and they're not. And I reached out to people I knew to sort of say, have you seen anything new and interesting recently? But places like Instagram are great for following people who kind of might not have much of an audience, but are doing really interesting stuff. So I found people who are there. And there's also people that have worked for me. So people like Annika Zetterman worked for me when she left college. And of course, she went back to Sweden and wrote New Nordic Gardens and is doing some interesting work there. But I also wanted to kind of have quite a widespread. I wanted it to be international in outlook because, particularly with climate change, we're all sort of facing the same challenges, but also there's a lot to be learnt from other political countries, if you know what I mean. So there's everything from residential gardens in there, and including some unusual residential gardens like Bethany Williams' garden right on the coast in Australia, through to things like the new headquarters for Uber. And I just thought that was kind of interesting because even that latter one, you could imagine it as your own personal space.
Yeah, there's some really good stuff in there. And also it's good because you can take the knowledge and the approach that you've detailed in the book, and that does apply globally, actually, because it's a process rather than a site-specific thing. And in that vein, you mention compositional archetypes, which I was really interested in. Can you explain a bit about those?
People talk about, oh, I'm going to do naturalistic planting, I'm going to do ornamental. And this came primarily from people telling me, oh, my planting is just like the wild and things. And I'm thinking, no, it's not. It's very ornamental in your approach to how you've chosen plants and how you put plants together. And so I had to kind of sit down and think, so what's everybody saying and what are they all doing? And I realised that it's a lot about the control that people have over those plants. And if we think about like a typical ornamental border, mixed border, and how that's very closely gardened so that there's something happening at any one time. And even we might plant pots of lilies in at something to fill a gap and all that sort of thing. That very sort of controlled nature of gardens and planting, through to a debate we now have about, well, what does wild and rewilding mean? The control on all that is quite a key thing there. And then also, as well as think about how controlled that planting design is, what's the outcome? And you can get everything from something which is very formal right through to something which is very spontaneous. For me, what's interesting about that, when I started thinking about these ways of composing with plants and bringing plants together, you realize that quite a few designers are saying my way of doing it is easier to maintain. And you realize that's not the case. What it is the aftercare that's involved ranges from something like ornamental planting, which is almost day to day, to something which is very naturalistic, which might be once a year. But when you do go in once a year, it's quite a big wholesale amount of aftercare. So it's not just about how you put plants together, it's about also how you maintain those plants as well.
And thinking about the wider process of how a garden functions, how it works, how it looks, is really an important step. And a lot of plants people will launch straight into thinking, oh, I'd love to see that there, I'd like to see that plant there. And the plants are there first kind of step along the road. But actually, and I think you teach this at college very well, it's about zooming out and taking stock of what you've got. And sometimes plants kind of almost are the last thing that factor in.
Well, I think the actual plants that you use are the last thing you factor in. At an earlier stage, you might start producing long lists of plants that come to you. But the point of a long list is to actually think, oh, if I think this tree would be great here, just write it down and then wipe it from your mind. So you carry on and you look at the composition of that planting. And in talking about planting design for people for so many years, I think the biggest revelation for them, and this includes talking to garden designers and landscape architects who've been doing it for a very, very long time, is that you can't design planting in 2D on a flat plan. You need to be thinking about, if I'm standing in front of that planting, what does it look like? And so I've always taught people to use 2D elevations as a starting point, and then work between that and a plan and think about the kind of the structure and the form that you want before you start thinking, okay, so what might that be? If you do that, it means you can do that several times and start experimenting. And a big thing for me that has worried me a lot about planting design for the last 20 years is the lack of innovation. That people do the same thing day in, day out, and they copy other people. It's kind of the reason we've got less and less plants available in the nurseries is because designers are using the same plants all the time. And you shouldn't be starting with a list of your favourite plants. You should be starting by saying, well, what have I got here in front of me? And what are the options there? How are the different ways I could approach this? What are the important things? What are the priorities? And experiment a bit. And when I say innovation, I mean using your imagination, using your creativity and using it for you. Nobody's saying you've got to innovate in terms of the industry and the whole area of planting design. It's just like, is there something new that you could do which is really relevant to this site and the story you're trying to tell? And bringing all those things together, it keeps you on your toes and it keeps you interested. I cannot tell you how many people over the years have come on our planting design diploma and said to me, I've kind of got a bit stale. I realise that I'm a bit bored with what I'm doing. And so this is kind of this idea of innovation is always trying to push you in new directions. I'm not saying that you won't do the same things in some places. And, a client will see what you've done somewhere else and love it and kind of say, I kind of want that look. But then you don't give them exactly the same. You respond to the site and the narrative that they're trying to tell to create something new. It can still structurally look the same, but you can sort of kind of explore other plants and things. And even to this day, when I'm doing planting designs, I'm always take the time to kind of go out there and find new plants and look at plants, because it's a little bit about experimenting. There's a little bit of experimentation, and it is only a little bit because our clients don't want us to experiment wholesale on their gardens. And the experimentation goes alongside going back and seeing what you've done and the success of what you've done, which is why people like Nigel Dunnett are so successful. He's a scientist and goes back and sees what he's done. They're really successful people. If you think about horticulturists, head gardeners, people like that, they're going back and they're always reviewing what they've done before and improving upon it.
Yeah, because otherwise you get pigeonholed as well, don't you? You
Absolutely.
get known for a look. Again, that leads to boredom, I imagine, in a lot of cases. Or you might love it, that's fine.
I think that also narrows your field. And, for most of us working as planting designers, we kind of have to have all these tools in our toolbox. We have to know kind of what a naturalistic planting is and what ornamental planting is and how they fit together. And after all, I think 80% of planting that's done today, at least 80%, is still ornamental, wherever you are in the world.
Yes. So you've got a long list of plants, as you said. How might you go about refining that down? That's not always easy, is it? I think, again, if you're a plants fan.
No, it's not. But the long list for me is primarily just putting those ideas down on paper. For the moment, a bit further on when I'm going to actually detail what plants I'm going to use. And so you might think, well, I really want a seasonal peak in, let's say, late spring, because my customers are away during the summer. So, as I think about these things, I can put them on a long list. But I might also have other factors in there, like plant qualities, like it's got to be drought resistant, or it's got to be within a particular range or colour palette. And so automatically some of those plants will drop out. But in having a long list, you can say, well, actually, I've got 3 trees here and I need to choose one. But these are all trees that I know about and I've used before and they work. I wonder if there's something else. And that's kind of where the innovation comes in, is like go out there and see if there is anything else, anything interesting. And I think that is how sometimes we end up with plants being used quite a lot. I don't know if you noticed, but there's shrubs like heptacodium have really started being interesting to people. And I think that comes from a few people going, well, what else is there? And of course, heptacodium is flowering August, September. This certainly is in my garden. And so they become popular. But I think just go out there and see what else is available. And it's quite difficult because, as I say, kind of the range of plants has reduced quite a lot. But we should also be thinking, going back to the sustainability thing, about what plants are going to do well in the future. And there's certain trees I just wouldn't plant now that are still being planted, still being produced in huge quantities. But we need to be thinking, well, okay, in 20, 30 years' time, are these, particularly trees and shrubs, are they going to survive?
Yeah. So you've got your long list, you've refined it down, you've done all your prep in your head or on paper, you've got your design. One of the things I really liked about the book was that you then talk about how to convey those ideas to clients. And a client, and you could be pitching a show garden, you could be doing a community garden pitch. It doesn't necessarily need to be a private or a commercial client, but there are certain ways of communicating your idea. And also it's very competitive out there. So What are the kind of things that you would recommend to people?
There is a whole section there on delivery, and kind of in the framework I propose it's the last bit, but actually the delivery of those ideas is all the way through, because you may well be getting a concept together that you need to go back to the client on and talk to them about. The question I get asked about most is, do you need to have CAD? I don't think you need to have CAD. There's lots of other ways you can present planting, and as long as you've got some computer skills and presentation skills, you can do that. One of the most useful ways of doing this is using mood boards, and actually not just the traditional mood board, which tells you every plant that's in a planting scheme, but actually those atmospheric mood boards, which kind of say, this is what I'm thinking of. And we have so much information available online that we can look at that. I actually think, sometimes if you just write down into your search engine what you're looking for, it will come back in spades with lots of other ideas. But yeah, mood boards particularly, I think, are really, really useful because they're very visual and people can understand what they're going to get. But further down the line, when you're kind of selecting the plants, using seasonal plant lists, and I show a number of ways of doing that, and also how you write out instructions, because things like matrix planting, which is covered within the book, is actually delivered by spreadsheets and instructions, not by planting plans. And I also think particularly 2D and 3D elevations, that sort of thing, are very, very useful in terms of being able to sketch and show customers. I used to call it any fool can sketch, but if you sit down with a customer, particularly British people, particularly Australians, this is my experience, are very auditory. And so if you talk them through what you're trying to do and sketch at the same time, they get it. But, we don't always know, particularly if you were talking about community gardens or public spaces, you're often not there to present your ideas. And so if you're producing, so let's say posters for a public consultation, then to have words and pictures is kind of the ideal way because you're going to hit everybody.
Yeah, I mean, there's some really quite innovative ways that people pitch, isn't there, including using music. We had that at the college this year. There's lots of ways, I think, that you can convey an idea, and sometimes you just need to get out of your own way. Speaking of which, I think it's fair to say that you've had some of the world's best designers come through your college, and you've taught them, and you've seen an awful lot of students come through. And of course, you work in an industry and they're your peers. Is there anything that you would say would be perhaps a common issue that's faced, or is there something that people worry about that they don't need to? Is there kind of anything that strikes you as a common theme?
I've always been one to tell people to just get out there and do it. I think you need to have some sort of strategy. The interesting thing about running a planting design diploma is there's a lot of people there who are very focused on plants, and in some ways that's a business strategy. There are people who've come on that course who are well-known designers, but they've become bored with the kind of construction part of it and things like that, and they kind of really want to be doing planting design all the time and being immersed in plants and things. And so that's kind of a strategy in itself. And I think once you get a strategy for what you want to do, then you just need to go out and do it. And there are a lot of people who waver because, my website's not up yet, or I'm not doing this yet, or I'm not doing that. And sometimes you just need to get out there and do it. And in our industry, we have these great skills which are so much in demand, but not everyone can afford us, and they can't afford it. So go out there and do stuff with, say, communities that they'll treat you like a superhero because you've got that knowledge and you can go and help them. But in helping them and doing those things, you get the photos for your website, you get the experience. And I think that's it. I think people's kind of waver a bit. It must be fantastic if you are within a social group or something where people just kind of turn up and employ you. But for most of us, we need to get out there and just do it. And, even to this day, I will still look at a small job as much as I look at a large job. People kind of think for some reason, because I've been doing it for so long, that I just do these big high profile jobs, and I don't, because for my cash flow, a small job where somebody's going to spend 2 or 3 grand on plants is just as valuable. But also sometimes that's the place where you can often experiment because the clients are willing to let you do that.
Yeah. But do you draw a line under that somewhere? Because I think a lot of people kind of fall into the trap of keep thinking, I'll do this to get my name out there, I'll do that to get the experience, and then end up forgetting to charge.
Once you walk through the doors of our college, you are a professional and you should always get paid for it. I think that's the most important thing. I mean, I have very strong views on people within our industry expecting gardeners and horticulturists, people to go and do stuff for free. I teach students at Wisley on diploma courses. I also teach Q diploma students at the School of Horticulture there. And I find it unbelievable how many people expect them to go and work for free. And they're professionals and they should be paid rightly. And often those designers who are asking that question are being paid handsomely anyway. And I've seen it at the other end by being a trustee of Perennial when I see how many people have to be helped to feed and clothe their children. For me, that's where the line is. I'm fortunate I'm not in that position, but yeah, people need to be paid properly.
Thanks to Andrew for sharing his wisdom, and to you as well for listening. If you like this episode, you might also enjoy episode 94, James Basson of Scape Design, and episode 205, Gardening on a Gradient. You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.